Hey there, I am number TJ47, and before I begin with explaining my Lavos build, I have a bit of a public service announcement. Um, See the green on the health bar? That is damage over time. If that bar, is filled all the way, the enemy's just gonna die. Obviously, most of us are just firing off automatically, so like, we're not paying it too much attention. But generally speaking, you know, while you're firing, if you see that bar filled up, it just means that you should, if you notice it, you just want to swap to a different enemy, and like come back for that particular enemy later. Obviously, like, it's not a perfect system, the bar, because the enemy can like heal and stuff, but generally speaking, just leave them for last. There's some reasons with this build. Because I'm using this shard, if you, as someone who is not a Lavos player, uh, or if you're playing with someone who is using this shard and you go killing these opponents that are about to die from like status damage or toxin damage, you are just killing your teammate. So don't focus on enemies that are going to die anyway. Don't waste your energy, don't waste your bullets for no reason. Just move on. Or, obviously, enemies in exterminate missions, excuse me, enemies in exterminate missions will, respawn faster the faster you kill enemies. So I'm not telling you not to, shoot enemies just because they're, gonna die within like a few seconds anyway. You can obviously kill them, just like don't purposefully do it for like kind of no reason. Don't focus on them. Okay, with that out of the way, um, introducing my Lavos build. So I'm running one casting speed shard, obviously the healing toxin shard, and 3 damage toxin shards, for reasons that you will see soon. Ignore Prime sure-footed. You could absolutely run Cunning Drift here, especially if you want to save Forma. That's purely a comfort thing because I mostly built this for running Archimedia. Deep temporal Archimedia was probably the number one thing on my mind when I was building this, especially because Lavos really doesn't care about most of the modifiers, just like Hildren. The only thing is that Lavos is much more of a support. Like, he can convert energy orbs and uh, health orbs into his personal sort of unique universal orbs, which count as both for the sake of a bunch of abilities. Go to the wiki if you want to understand it fully. And also he converts ammo, and there are modifiers, personal modifiers on Deep Archimedia that reduce the amount of ammo you have. And Lavos, unlike Hildren, he tends to solve problems for his team more. Like with the ammo, Hildren gets around that by having an exalted weapon. Lavos doesn't have an exalted weapon. He just creates ammo for the entire team. And instead of like having reduced healing, I forget the name of the modifier, but Lavos just increases the amount of energy and healing his team gets. And it helps people just stack their abilities or their arcanes faster with the health orbs and just do more stuff overall. So he's very good for temporal Archimedia, but he's not nearly as good in terms of like, he's more of a support in that way. If you do a lot of damage on Lavos, because this build uses Toxin, which is like a damage over time effect, if you're doing the most damage on your team in Deep Archimedia, that's actually really bad, because that means that your team is killing enemies so slowly that you're the one who's like doing all the damage. Oh, by the way, there's more combos here. There's a whole bunch of synergies in this build. You'll notice that my companion is doing toxic damage. That actually counts for the healing. on that emerald shard. So the companion, when it procs Toxin on stuff, will actually start healing you. And also, the Toxin shards are actually super flexible. They don't care whether you deal the Toxin with your companion, your abilities, or your own weapons. It applies to everything. It's one of the things that's really great about it, because Lavos does have good ability damage with Catalyze, but he also has Valence Formation. And with Valence Formation, you know, you can just get... One thing I see people do all the time is they add Viral. They use Viral on their primary weapon, which works fine against, you know, relatively, you know, old and weak corrupted enemies, which that, as a very old Warframe player, feels a little weird to say that the corrupted enemies are now considered extremely weak. But if we go to something stronger, it does... Well, actually, I'd probably have to spawn... just because the Bubonico is so powerful, I'd have to spawn something a lot stronger. Probably a bunch of Dedicants. I get a bunch of Dedicants. You know, it takes much longer to take them out. I'm actually, like, running out of ammo on the Bubonico doing this. The reason I use Toxin in this build is because with a shotgun, it actually stacks so many Toxin procs. This is not entirely fair because I threw Viral on every single enemy there. So I'm just going to respawn these. Let's see how that whole health bar turns green the moment I shoot them. That is the power of using Toxin on Lavos with the extra damage. I'm gonna explain the Toxin dash a little bit later, but just so you know, that is probably the biggest takeaway I've learned from creating this build, is that I think every Lavos build from now on should take this shard, every single one, no exceptions, and I think they need to have Archon continuity. Once again, no exceptions. And I think we all need to put Toxin on our dash, because it provides so much survivability. And also, so many things I've learned in terms of constraints. I think I'd always run Arcane Persistence from now on Lavos. I can't imagine health or shield tanking on him anymore. He doesn't have any real synergy with shields, but he does have a bunch of healing through Ophidian Bite. So it's kind of a default, and with his base stats and armor actually being pretty good, I think he's a very big candidate for Arcane Persistence. The only problem with that is that for Arcane Persistence, Lavos doesn't have a big enough health pool for Arcane Grace to make him completely invulnerable like it can with Inaros, for example. So, to solve that, we need this shard. We need the healing Toxin shard. And the best ability to use with it is the dash. The dash leaves these little zones which continuously proc Toxin on enemies. And the thing is, that healing shard actually, it does scale per stack, but it has a cap of 10 per enemy. So you can't just take the Coda Bubonico and, like, you know, get 100 stacks on an enemy like this Dedicant, you know? Which, did I cover this a second ago? Yeah, because Valence Formation applies your imbued elemental effect on every single pellet of a weapon. You want something with high fire rate, multi-shot, and like overall damage. You don't actually care about the status that much. This Bubonico has 18% status per projectile, which is pretty decent for a shotgun. But the thing is, when you run valence formation, it has a 100% chance of proccing Toxin. So it's super easy on a tougher enemy to just get 200, 300 right there. Toxin procs, and I'm not even shooting him anymore. He's just certain to die at that point. Just because of how many Toxin procs this can stack. Obviously, Lavos is, because of that, isn't so good against enemies that have a limit to how many status effect, how much those can stack. But other than that, he's quite good, and he is kind of half a support anyway. Like, he primes a bunch of enemies. He has something that can like turn all the orbs into like universal orbs, and he does quite a bit for his team. So I don't think we need to worry too much about his sort of weakness when it comes to some boss enemies. Generally, he just supplies enough to his team for that not to be a serious issue. He's also, with this Toxin dash and everything, for temporal Archimedia, and like, the elite Archimedias, he is just extraordinarily difficult to kill. I have really not died with him as of late. I think it's like, I was going to say it's like technically possible. It's obviously possible if you get lazy enough. But if you're playing decently on Lavos, you're not going to die. I've actually been trying to solo Deep Temporal Archimedia this week. Hopefully I managed to do that. I know that I could, I want to get a Hound, which is going to improve this build tremendously. And then I'm going to be able to probably solo that pretty easily. But to be totally honest, I have never beaten a Sister of Parvos, because I think I'm a little worried that as I learn another, Kuva Lich-like system, that I'm going to just have a mental breakdown. I I hate that thing. Anyway, um, let me get back to my notes. So for Deep Archimedia, the Archimedias, personal injury is the only like disqualifying modifier, just like how Hildren has her like shield, the shield removal modifier just disqualifies her from being used. Lavos kinda has the same thing. You could technically maybe change Lavos in some ways to counteract it, but honestly, you're probably better finding something that makes good use of like some kind of invulnerability. Thinking probably Nyx. But generally speaking, I think that Lavos is kind of a universal pick for me. It's him and Hildren are the number one and number two in my mind for Archimedia. Fractured armor does also kind of matter for him, but then you just, um, the minus 10% armor per ability used. But if that happens, um, all you really do is just stop using abilities so often. Just rely more on your weapon damage. It can be disqualifying if you have like other bad modifiers like negative ammo and you need to use transmutation probe to get ammo back. That can be kind of brutal, but for the most part, it's not automatically disqualifying. He does have generally more support for his team most of the time anyway. I find that Lavos is a bit better in a bad team than most other Warframes, just because of his like support nature. And the fact that when his team is not very good, his damage over time starts to actually take effect. With that out of the way, I'm just going to move on to more to do with the build. Just going to run through my notes here because I'm a little off topic here. I already went over sure-footed versus cunning drift. Please just use cunning drift if you are doing anything, even like most content in the game. You do not need this, really. And I would say, frankly speaking, you don't need it just in general. You should really just use cunning drift. I just have so much on Lavos, with the 4 Omniforma and the 2 Umbral Forma. Uh, I can just do that. As for this, for your aura mod, I really haven't found that any of them make that big a difference to Lavos. You could run corrosive projection, but Lavos with like Toxin applying corrosive, he already deals with armor very well, and with especially with the heat on this. So when you put Toxin on your Catalyze, you have heat and corrosive applied to a bunch of stuff. And because corrosive and viral are more powerful on their first status application than they used to be, um, it just doesn't matter as much that you need to stack everything. And armor, since I think the Jade Shadows, or was it Constellations of the first Jade quest, whichever update, um, armor has been changed significantly, so it's not nearly as important. So, which is actually quite good for Lavos's Toxin build, because Toxin does take reduced damage from armor, but it bypasses shields completely, which can be a little bit useful. Another option here, I forget what Lavos originally comes with in terms of polarities on this. So you could go growing power, corrosive projection, or physique, depending on what that is. Or you could just go Dreamer's Bond if none of those happen to be. If it just so happens to be, I think only Naramon, Vazarin, or Madurai are ever in the Aura slot, actually. I don't think I've seen anything else by default, so I guess it would have to be physique, corrosive projection, or growing power. So I guess that kind of just covers it. Um, Next in line is, yeah, the must-haves. I would say when it comes to every Lavos build, I think every Lavos build has to have Valence Formation, Archon Continuity, Stretch, Overextended, and now I would say Lingering Transmutation, actually. This was originally a flex slot. I have completely changed my mind on that after testing Lingering Transmutation more. This thing is absolutely cracked, and you need to use it on every single build. And to be clear, I'm going with Overextended in every build, and I think it's not negotiable. I think Strength is not that valuable a stat on Lavos because of the way that Catalyze scales. Catalyze has exponential scaling, and if you don't know how to do the math, I'm just going to have to ask you to trust me on this, that adding damage to this is not going to do anything compared to just adding one extra status effect before you hit something with Catalyze. It is important to note that Catalyze doesn't include its own status effects for the doubling of the damage. So if you let me go back here and actually demo this. Did I pause them? That doesn't matter. So if I do this, they all have 3 status effects on them. And that does like good damage, but probably not as good damage as you would expect, considering. I think I'm going to turn off Nautilus. I have a build kind of ready to go here in my testing build. So it doesn't do as much damage as you'd expect. However, if I go in here with this, and then I do something like a heat probe, now they have 5 on them, and it does significantly more. Do remember these are Dedicant Eximus, so they are not weak enemies by any means. Also, that's kind of an awful sound. So yeah, I would never expect Lavos' ability damage to actually take those guys out easily. What I would more expect, actually, is that I would shoot them and then dash in and then use that. That is more of what I would expect to do against some actually tough enemies when I'm playing Lavos, because Lavos with the Toxin build can use both his weapons and his abilities to do damage. His abilities are quite good at priming stronger enemies and just outright killing weaker ones. So really, you know, most Warframes either focus on just ability damage or just buffing their weapons, and Lavos is kind of a weird exception in that. He can just do both. He can just have his cake and eat it too in that regard, because with Catalyze's scaling being so strong and like exponential, you really don't need to do any of that. You don't need power strength, really. You can just hit the enemies more with your abilities, apply more status effects, and they'll die, basically no matter what your strength stat is. Now, obviously, you know, you saw Umbral Intensify here. I'm not going to go too much into, like, how I balanced out the math. But just know there is a good reason I went with Umbral mods here. And I did test our Archon Vitality. It does... The thing is, it doesn't work the way that the description says it does. And it's actually less powerful than even I thought it would be. I don't know exactly what's going on with this mod, but on Catalyze it's supposed to add another heat proc and like do quite a bit more damage. But honestly, I didn't find it to be very noticeable at all. Part of me wonders if it's bugged. If everyone else like could just do a little bit of testing on this, I'd be quite curious, but I just found that it was not all that helpful, and it doesn't really help this build very much. We'd much rather have that incredibly high health value for Arcane Persistence and Arcane Grace, and like the armor is great, and the ability strength does actually work out. This is equivalent to, I think, like 1.5 status effects in like a sort of mathematical sense when you have overextended. So it does kind of work out. It is just one mod that does, you know, a whole extra status effect on basically every single one of your catalyze, and a little bit on every single other ability, and like obviously helps a bit with the health drain on Ophidian Bite. It's worth getting back to 100 strength on Lavos. I will admit that. Strength is not so bad that we don't care about it at all. It's fine. It's not something we're mad about. It's not something we want that badly. Lavos is not a traditional nuke. You know, even with this, most of them, you know, they're gonna die, but it's gonna take a while, you know, just because Lavos uses damage over time. So, next on, I had a whole section here on the flex slot that I forgot to remove. Let's see. Oh yeah, you could actually remove Arcane Grace if you really wanted to. If you were really confident in your Toxin healing, or if you did something crazy like removing your casting speed shard or removing one of these in favor of even more healing, you could replace Arcane Grace with, I think, Impetus. I am not a huge fan of Impetus. I don't think Strength is very useful on Lavos, as I've said before. And I think the ability efficiency is fine, but it's 30% ability efficiency at max stacks. And Arcane Impetus is just incredibly annoying to stack, even on Lavos. So no, I'm not, frankly speaking, I am never going to put this on. I think that it is annoying for the vast majority of missions. Okay, that moves us on to combos on Lavos. So, number one combo I use constantly is the Toxic Dash. That just stacks toxic effects continuously with these little areas so that they constantly heal you, with the healing like capping out at 10 toxin stacks. So you basically always want to put toxin on this dash unless you're purposefully dashing into something to nuke it. Then you can do something like a viral dash into toxic probe, into toxic catalyze, which will do quite a bit of damage. It's relatively fast to pull off, and with the augment for the probe, this probe will like stay here and last so much longer. It's very, very good. And I would definitely prefer to have toxin on the probe because that'll continuously create healing for you. Your Vile Rush is actually your lowest cooldown ability. It has a cooldown of only 5 seconds. So I would absolutely never subsume it off. Actually, that's another thing that I would say for every Lavos build going forward. I think there is no reason to subsume anything off. Not just because it's bad, but because you're not playing Lavos at that point. Brozyme has a really good point about this, where there's no point playing a Warframe if you're not doing something that the Warframe like does. It's like there's no reason to play Nyx if you're not using the invulnerability. There's no reason to play Excalibur if you're not using swords. Even if it would be better in the meta not to do those things. You know, you could just, if you want to play Revenant, just play Revenant. Don't turn everything else into Revenant, is the main takeaway. Okay. So, let's see. Back to my notes. So, when thinking about your abilities, the dash has basically a priming radius. And within that radius is kind of like your actual damage zone. So, you know, you use your toxin dash into the center. Maybe you use like a heat probe or something. Well, I guess you should probably use toxin probe. Sometimes I use heat probe. Sometimes I like do other things that I probably shouldn't be doing because I have so much random muscle memory from the past. But yeah, you basically prime a bunch of stuff. Then when you use catalyze, there's a bunch of stuff near you that gets damaged from the stuff that's primed from your dash. But then further out, where these probes go, like all the way out here, they'll prime everything else like outward for basically for your teammates. So because I'm putting toxin on catalyze, what that's gonna do is it's just gonna put heat, toxin, and corrosive on everything on the same level as like Lavos. So if you don't know how Lavos's like sort of height mechanic on catalyze works, like everything that's like around him but not like above or below him is what's going to get hit in a very, very large radius and through walls, actually. Very, very useful. And he's also one of the few Warframes that gets to do that. Line of sight is usually a big thing on a lot of Warframes. So, another thing, which I forget if I showcased it earlier, I don't think I did, is that you can do, that's the opposite of what I wanted to do with that second, but you can do Toxic Dash into your Electric Lash into Toxic Catalyze is another combo if you don't want to waste your probe in that moment. That's another good combo. It's much better as a combo when you have no good weapon in Archimedia. You want to do a lot more like complex combos that increase status effects a lot more, or when you're just like supporting your team in a way. Doing like combos that prime more interesting status effects when you have a good team is a little bit more valuable. But for other combos, there's a few fun things you can do actually that are also somewhat practical, especially at lower levels. My favorite of which being Blast Dash. For some reason, Blast does like triple status stacking on abilities, even though it's a damaging ability. So on Lavos, when you do something like Viral, which doesn't do damage as a status effect, and you apply it, it actually applies three stacks of it. And for some reason, that applies to Blast. So if you're in a low level mission, you can actually just apply Blast and have a bunch of AoE, and it actually works very well. The other thing you can do is Gas. Gas has really good AoE. You don't have to worry about the way that it works in terms of like not damaging the enemy itself and only having the AoE like you would with Blast. These enemies are not quite low enough level for this to be effective, but there it is if you want it. I think I already went over the weapons a little bit for Lavos. The biggest thing for Lavos is, you know, the multi-shot and fire rate with the overall total damage. Obviously, you want a good spread of statuses that you don't regularly apply using your abilities. Mainly radiation magnetic. Those are very big ones because you never really want to use your abilities to create them. So, you know, you should have them on your weapon, and the mods for them aren't too bad anyway. And also, this is, you know, my Coda Bubonico build, which is, oh, also ignore the Riven. You can just slot Prime Point Blank in there. It's essentially just as good. It doesn't have the disposition for a Riven to really matter. But where was I? Yeah, you could try doing this build. It's pretty good. And the Coda Bubonico does have the condition overload mechanic / bug with Galvanized Savvy. Unfortunately, I do not know how to explain this whole thing, but essentially you can think of the damage from this and from primary Merciless being like not additive with each other. It's multiplicative. So like instead of doing, well, you know what? I'm not going to try to explain it. I'm not going to try to explain it. Just look it up. So the Coda Bubonico is really good. You can obviously use the Ceto Prime. It's a fine weapon. It doesn't have the same thing on its primary fire like the Coda Bubonico, so it's not as good. It also, if I remember correctly, like the ammo conversion is so hilariously bad as a unique thing for Lavos, just because he has an ability that creates universal ammo. So you shouldn't really think of the Ceto as being a Lavos specific weapon at all. It really doesn't have any benefit to run it with him out of anyone in the game particularly. Yeah, there is actually a reason that I created this build now and not previously. I think it wasn't as good previously because we didn't have the indicator for how much damage the status effects on something was going to do. So damage over time was just so much weaker. It's not a direct buff, but it's a huge indirect buff. I believe that change came with constellations. And it's a very good indirect buff. And obviously the healing with Impetus. Impetus, I think, is a bit newer of an Arcane. I don't think anyone has stumbled on this build before. There was a few kind of original things that needed to all sort of come together for this build to be practical. So I think it's starting to actually be good. I think this build is actually something that Lavos can like distinctly do and be good at that other frames kind of can't, especially because of his extra status duration that comes from your normal duration. That makes this a very, very good, a playstyle that's very specific to Lavos. Like the damage from Catalyze, when you use Toxin on this, you're essentially doing 10 times the base damage of Catalyze because of all the extra damage shards, because of the duration of the Toxin, and, you know, because of the added status duration because of Lavos. So it combines very well. Another thing I do find that catalyzes, you know, obviously with heat and corrosive being applied to stuff, it's very good versus armor, you know, at those larger ranges in particular. I have found him to be fairly well balanced overall in terms of who he fights well. The only people he doesn't fight very well are the sentients. That's the number one faction that I found he's not so good with. There are a few There's a few other options. I'd be curious if anyone wants to test these. I know that you can do some shenanigans with like heat on your secondary or with blast. There are some blast based shards that could be worth testing. I don't think I'm personally as excited about it compared to Toxin because Toxin applies to everything. There's also the fact that you can use electricity for like melee influence. I'm not sure exactly what weapon I'd use for that, to be totally honest. On Lavos, it would have to have very high attack speed in particular, very low status chance to kind of compensate because Lavos gives things like 100% electric proc chance, but I can't say I understand melee influence enough to actually make that build myself. So I'm just putting that out there. Lavos could actually kind of have a decent electric build for a melee, if we can find the right melee. It would also just be pretty good in terms of having kind of another option. Even if, you know, you don't build into it fully, it would make Lavos be able to do a little bit more. Because melee influence is, you know, just good a lot of the time. But I don't think it's too serious of a possibility. Overall, I think Lavos, with this build, you know, he has good weapon damage, great ability damage, and he has good survivability. It's kind of everything I ever wanted from a Lavos build. Frankly, it's even thematic, if you think about it. Like, Lavos with the snake theme, plus, like, using toxin damage, it's kind of perfect, actually. So yeah, I think that is all of my notes. So thank you for watching. I might have, you know what, I'm going to leave any gameplay out of this actually. Thank you for watching. I might post a separate video if I manage to solo Elite Temporal Archimedia. Alright, see ya.